Picture yourself living in a world where washing your hands before surgery was considered an insult to your professional dignity. Imagine a time when sharing a communal sponge in public restrooms was perfectly normal, when bathing was believed to open your pores to deadly diseases, and when mercury was prescribed as a miracle cure for everything from indigestion to syphilis. This wasn't some distant, primitive civilization. These were the everyday realities of our not-so-distant ancestors, including some of the most educated and wealthy people of their time. Throughout human history, the concept of personal hygiene has undergone a dramatic transformation that would seem almost unbelievable to us today. What we now understand as basic cleanliness was once viewed with suspicion, fear, and sometimes outright hostility. The very practices we consider essential for health and social acceptance were once thought to be dangerous, unnecessary, or even immoral. The role of personal hygiene in human civilization extends far beyond simple cleanliness. It has been intertwined with religion, social status, medical understanding, and cultural beliefs. From the ancient Romans who used urine as mouthwash to the Victorian doctors who refused to wash their hands between patients, our ancestors lived in a world where the most basic understanding of disease prevention was not just absent but actively rejected. These weren't isolated incidents or the practices of uneducated people. Kings and queens, doctors and priests, scholars and merchants all participated in hygiene practices that would horrify us today. They did so not out of ignorance, but because their understanding of health, disease, and the human body was fundamentally different from ours. What seems obvious to us now, that cleanliness prevents disease, was once a revolutionary, controversial idea that cost careers and sometimes lives to promote. The journey from these dangerous practices to modern hygiene standards represents one of humanity's greatest public health achievements, built on the discoveries of germ theory, antiseptics, and our growing understanding of how diseases spread. But the path was neither straight nor easy, and the cost in human lives was enormous. So, settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey through the most revolting chapters of human hygiene history. Tonight, we're going to explore 15 of the most disgusting, dangerous, and widespread hygiene practices that our ancestors not only tolerated, but actively embraced. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're reminders of how fragile our understanding of health can be, and how easily we can slip back into practices that seem reasonable at the time, but prove deadly in retrospect. Get comfortable, because we're about to dive deep into a world where common sense was turned upside down, where the cure was often worse than the disease, and where the simple act of washing your hands could mark you as a dangerous radical. Let's begin our exploration of humanity's most unhygienic habits and discover how we finally learned to wash our way to better health. Number 1. The Great Bathing Boycott, when cleanliness was next to deadliness. In the heart of medieval Europe, you would have lived in a world where the sight of someone preparing for a bath would have filled you with genuine concern for their well-being. Not because you worried about them slipping on wet stone floors or drowning in wooden tubs, but because you truly believed that immersing their body in water would open every pore to disease, demons, and death itself. This wasn't superstition born from ignorance. It was medical advice backed by the most learned physicians of the time. As you walked through the streets of 14th century Paris or London, you would have passed by public bathhouses that had been boarded up and abandoned, not because people had lost interest in bathing, but because bathing had been declared a public health menace. The transformation from the Roman era, when elaborate public baths were the centre of social life, to medieval Europe's bath phobia happened gradually but thoroughly. You would have been taught that the human body was surrounded by a protective layer of dirt and oils that acted as armor against illness. Washing this away was like removing your natural defenses and inviting pestilence directly into your bloodstream. If you had been wealthy during this period, your approach to cleanliness would have been entirely different from what we understand today. Instead of washing your body, you would have focused obsessively on changing your linen undergarments. These shirts and shifts, made from expensive white linen, were believed to absorb the body's impurities. You would have owned dozens of them, changing them multiple times per day, while your actual skin remained unwashed for months or even years. Your servants would have spent hours each day washing, starching, and pressing these linens to pristine whiteness, because clean linen was the ultimate status symbol. Visitors to your home would have judged your wealth and refinement not by the cleanliness of your body, but by the brilliant white of your collar and cuffs peeking out from beneath your outer garments. As a member of the lower classes, even this linen-changing luxury would have been impossible. You might have owned 1 or 2 linen shirts that you would have worn until they literally fell apart. Your entire approach to cleanliness would have consisted of occasionally splashing cold water on your face and hands, and perhaps changing your clothes when they became too stiff with accumulated filth to move comfortably. The medical establishment of the time provided scientific backing for these practices. Physicians would have explained to you that the human body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, that needed to remain in perfect balance. They believed that bathing disrupted this balance by forcing the humours to rush toward the skin's surface, where they would be vulnerable to corruption by outside air. You would have been warned that hot baths were particularly dangerous because they opened the pores so wide that diseases could march directly into your body like armies through open gates. Cold baths were considered nearly suicidal, as they would shock the humours into such violent imbalance that immediate death could result. The fear wasn't limited to full-body bathing. Even washing your hair was considered risky because it might allow evil vapours to enter through the scalp and corrupt the brain. Instead, you would have worn elaborate headdresses and caps designed to contain any odours and maintain the natural oils that were believed to protect your mind from madness. During plague years, these beliefs intensified to the point of paranoia. You would have been absolutely convinced that anyone who bathed during an epidemic was committing suicide. The coincidence that some people who bathed did indeed fall ill, likely from contaminated water sources or other factors, was taken as proof that washing caused plague rather than prevented it. Religious authorities added their weight to the anti-bathing movement. You would have been taught that excessive attention to bodily cleanliness was a form of vanity that distracted from spiritual matters. Monks and nuns were praised for their holy stench, which was seen as evidence of their devotion to higher matters than earthly comfort. This bathophobia reached such extremes that by the 16th century, some European cities had laws requiring bathhouses to close during certain times of year when bathing was deemed especially dangerous. You would have lived in a society where the smell of unwashed humanity was so universal that it was simply part of the atmosphere, no more remarkable than the smell of horses or cooking fires. The turning point came slowly, beginning in the 17th century, when some brave physicians began to question whether dirt really provided protection against disease. But it wasn't until the 1862 when germ theory finally explained how diseases actually spread, that you would have begun to understand that cleanliness prevented illness rather than caused it. Even then, the transition wasn't immediate. You would have witnessed fierce debates in medical journals, with older physicians insisting that their patients had been healthier when they avoided bathing, while younger doctors presented evidence that clean hospitals had lower death rates than dirty ones. The final victory of cleanliness came with the development of better plumbing, cheaper soap, and mass-produced bathing facilities. By the 1892nd, you would have seen the construction of grand public bathhouses in major cities, designed not just for cleanliness, but to actively promote bathing as a civic virtue. The irony is that while our ancestors feared that bathing would kill them, their avoidance of bathing actually did kill them in enormous numbers through the spread of diseases that simple washing could have prevented. Typhus, cholera, dysentery, and countless skin infections thrived in the perpetually unwashed bodies of medieval Europe, taking millions of lives that could have been saved by something as simple as soap and water. Today, as you step into your morning shower without a second thought, you're participating in a ritual that your ancestors would have viewed as a dangerous and potentially suicidal act. The warm water that feels so natural and refreshing to you would have seemed like an invitation to disease and death to someone living just a few centuries ago. Number 2. The communal toothstick. When dental hygiene was a group activity. Imagine sitting down to dinner with your family and, at the end of the meal, watching as everyone takes turns using the same wooden stick to clean their teeth. You would scrape away the remnants of your meal with the same implement that had just been in your brother's mouth, your father's mouth, and your grandmother's mouth. This wasn't considered disgusting. It was considered practical, economical, and perfectly normal. This was your reality for thousands of years across most human civilizations. The concept of personal dental hygiene tools simply didn't exist. Instead, families would share chew sticks twigs from specific trees that had been frayed at one end to create a primitive brush. These sticks, usually made from aromatic woods like licorice root or neem trees, served entire households for weeks or months until they became too worn to use. As you used your family's communal chew stick, you would have been participating in a dental care ritual that stretched back to ancient Egypt. The technique was always the same. You would chew the end of the stick until the fibers separated into a brush-like tool, then scrub your teeth and gums with the frayed end while using the pointed end to pick at stubborn food particles. What you wouldn't have realized was that with each use, the stick became a repository of bacteria, food particles, and disease from every mouth it had touched. By the time it reached you, the innocent-looking piece of wood had become a biological weapon capable of transmitting everything from gum disease to more serious infections. In wealthier households, you might have graduated to metal toothpicks made from silver, gold, or bronze. These were considered luxury items, often ornately decorated and passed down through generations like family heirlooms. But even these precious implements were shared among family members, accumulating decades' worth of bacteria and oral debris. The dinner table ritual of communal toothpicking was so ingrained in social customs that elaborate etiquette developed around it. You would have learned specific rules about when to pick your teeth, never before everyone had finished eating, how to hold the implement with your non-dominant hand to show it was a casual activity, and how to dispose of extracted food particles discreetly into a special bowl provided for the purpose. Medieval monasteries developed their own version of communal dental care. You would have observed monks sharing wooden or bone toothpicks during their meals, believing that individual implements encouraged vanity and self-focus that distracted from spiritual contemplation. The communal toothpick became a symbol of their commitment to poverty and unity. In ancient Rome, the situation became even more revolting. Wealthy Romans would employ servants whose job was to pre-chew their toothpicks, literally putting the implement in their own mouths to soften the wood before handing it to their masters. You would have considered this the height of luxury service, never realizing that you were essentially having your teeth cleaned with a tool that had just been in a slave's mouth. The sharing extended beyond families to entire communities. In some cultures, public toothpicks were available in taverns and meeting halls, used by dozens of strangers throughout the day. You would think nothing of using a toothpick that had been in the mouths of people you'd never met, people who might have been suffering from any number of oral diseases or infections. Even when individual toothbrushes began to appear in China around the 7th century, made from bamboo handles with bristles from wild boars, the concept of personal ownership took centuries to catch on elsewhere. European merchants who encountered these toothbrushing sticks often purchased one for their entire household to share, completely missing the point of the innovation. The medical community of the time actually endorsed communal dental tools. Physicians would explain that sharing implements helped balance the humours between family members. If one person had excess heat in their mouth, sharing a toothpick with someone who had excess cold would benefit both parties. They believed that individual tools disrupted the natural harmony that should exist within households. Religious authorities also supported the practice. You would have been taught that insisting on your own personal dental implements was a form of pride and selfishness that separated you from your community. The shared toothpick represented Christian virtue. The willingness to literally put something in your mouth that had been in your neighbour's mouth was seen as an act of faith and brotherly love. The quality of these communal implements was often appalling. Village toothpicks might be carved from any available wood, regardless of whether it was suitable for oral use. You might find yourself using implements made from toxic woods, or sticks that had been used for other purposes before being converted to dental tools. Even more disturbing was the practice of toothpick inheritance. When someone died, their personal toothpicks, if they owned individual ones, would be passed down to family members or friends as meaningful keepsakes. You might spend your entire life using a toothpick that had been in the mouth of your deceased grandfather, considering it a way to maintain a connection with his memory. The turning point came in the 18th century when mass production made individual toothbrushes affordable for the middle class. But even then, many families continued sharing, because the idea of individual dental tools seemed wasteful and antisocial. It took another century for the concept of personal dental hygiene to become truly universal. The medical consequences of communal dental tools were devastating, though they weren't understood at the time. Gum disease, tooth decay, and oral infections spread through families and communities like wildfire. Children would lose their teeth before adulthood, not from lack of care, but from exposure to every oral bacteria and pathogen their family members carried. When you brush your teeth tonight with your own personal toothbrush, you're engaging in a form of hygiene that would have seemed selfish, wasteful, and medically unnecessary to most of your ancestors. The simple act of having your own dental care tools represents a revolution in thinking about personal hygiene and individual health that took thousands of years to develop. Number 3. The golden mouthwash, when urine was considered nature's perfect antiseptic. Every morning, you would have begun your dental routine not by reaching for minty fresh mouthwash, but by collecting the first urine of the day, preferably your own, though family members' urine was considered acceptable in a pinch. You would swish this warm, ammonia-rich liquid around your mouth for several minutes, believing you were giving yourself the finest oral care available. This wasn't the practice of desperate people with no alternatives. This was the preferred dental hygiene method of emperors, senators, and the wealthiest citizens of ancient Rome. You would have paid premium prices for imported Portuguese urine, which was considered the gold standard of oral care products, prized for its supposed superior whitening and antibacterial properties. The Roman poet Catullus wrote admiringly about Spanish women whose teeth were so brilliantly white from their urine washing routine that it was considered the height of beauty. You would have envied these women and tried to emulate their results by being even more diligent about your own urine mouthwash regimen. The medical theory behind this practice seemed logical within the framework of ancient understanding. Roman physicians explained to you that urine contained the body's purified essences, concentrated and refined by the kidneys, into a powerful medicinal substance. They believed that morning urine was especially potent because it had been concentrated overnight, making it the perfect antiseptic for mouth care. You would have been taught that different types of urine had different medicinal properties. Child's urine was considered gentler and better for sensitive teeth, while the urine of healthy young adults was preferred for its strength in fighting oral infections. Pregnant women's urine was thought to have special properties that could strengthen loose teeth and prevent tooth loss. The practice wasn't limited to just swishing and spitting. You would have been encouraged to brush your teeth with urine, using cloth soaked in the liquid to scrub away plaque and stains. Some people would even soak their wooden toothpicks in urine overnight, believing this enhanced their cleaning power and made them more effective at preventing dental problems. Roman households developed elaborate rituals around urine collection for oral care. You would have learned to collect your urine in specific vessels, often made from precious metals or fine pottery, and to store it properly to maintain its medicinal potency. The morning's first urination was considered most valuable, and family members might compete for access to this premium oral care product. The wealthy would employ servants specifically to collect and manage their urine supplies for dental care. These servants would be trained to recognize the best quality urine, to store it properly, and to prepare it for use. You might have owned special silver or gold vessels designed specifically for urine mouthwash, elaborately decorated implements that were displayed alongside other luxury items. Dinner parties would sometimes feature communal urine mouthwash ceremonies, where hosts would provide premium urine for their guests' oral care needs. You would have considered this the height of hospitality, and guests would compliment their hosts on the quality and effectiveness of the urine provided. The practice spread throughout the Roman Empire and persisted long after Rome's fall. Medieval European nobles continued using urine mouthwash well into the Renaissance period, though they often added herbs and spices to mask the smell and taste. You might have used urine mixed with mint, rosemary, or rose petals, creating elaborate recipes that were passed down through generations. Medical texts provided detailed instructions for urine oral care. You would have learned that the urine should be used at body temperature for maximum effectiveness, that it should be swished for exactly the right amount of time, usually described in terms of prayers or songs, and that certain times of day were better than others for the treatment. The practice wasn't limited to the wealthy. Even poor families would save their urine for oral care, considering it too valuable to waste. Children would be taught from an early age to collect their urine carefully and to use it properly for dental hygiene. It was seen as a free, renewable resource that nature provided specifically for health maintenance. Some regions developed specialized urine preparation techniques. You might have learned to age your urine for several days to increase its potency, or to mix urine from multiple family members to create what was believed to be a more balanced and effective oral care product. These family recipes were guarded secrets passed down from parent to child. The decline of urine mouthwash began in the 18th century, when early chemists started to understand what urine actually contained and why it seemed to have some antibacterial properties. The ammonia in urine did indeed kill some bacteria, which explained why the practice appeared to work, but it also damaged tooth enamel and gum tissue in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Even as commercial mouthwashes became available in the 19th century, many people continued using urine because they believed it was more natural and effective than manufactured products. You might have used both, starting your day with traditional urine mouthwash and finishing with commercial products for social acceptability. The last holdouts for urine mouthwash were surprisingly persistent. Some rural communities continued the practice into the early 20th century, and there are documented cases of elderly people maintaining their urine oral care routines well into the 1952nd, convinced that it was superior to modern dental products. The irony is that while urine mouthwash did have some antibacterial properties due to its ammonia content, it also caused long-term damage to teeth and gums that far outweighed any temporary benefits. Many of the dental problems that Romans attributed to old age or poor constitution were actually caused by their lifetime of urine oral care. When you rinse with your modern, scientifically formulated mouthwash tonight, remember that you're rejecting a practice that was considered not just normal, but medically advanced and socially sophisticated for over 1,000 years. The minty freshness you take for granted would have seemed artificial and inferior to someone who believed that nature's own golden antiseptic was the perfect oral care solution. Number 4. The gentlemanly hands when doctors refused to wash before surgery. Picture yourself lying on an operating table in 1847, watching as your surgeon approaches you directly from the autopsy room, where he has just been elbow deep in a corpse. His hands are still stained with the blood and fluids of the cadaver he was dissecting, but he makes no move towards the wash basin in the corner. When a young colleague suggests he might want to clean his hands before operating on you, your surgeon's face reddens with indignation. "Are you suggesting," he would roar, "that the hands of a gentleman could carry disease? That my years of medical training and social standing count for nothing? The very idea is preposterous and insulting." And with his unwashed, contaminated hands, he would begin cutting into your living flesh, confident that his professional status provided all the cleanliness necessary. This scene played out thousands of times in hospitals across Europe and America during the mid-19th century. You would have been operated on by doctors who moved seamlessly from dissecting rotting corpses to delivering babies, from examining infected wounds to performing amputations, all without ever washing their hands or changing their clothes. The medical establishment's resistance to hand washing wasn't based on ignorance of the suggestion. It was based on a deep-seated belief that gentlemen's hands were inherently clean, regardless of what they touched. Your surgeon would have graduated from the finest medical schools, studied under renowned professors, and published papers in prestigious journals. The idea that he needed to wash his hands like a common labourer was not just medically unnecessary, it was socially offensive. Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis discovered in the 1842 that hand-washing with chlorinated lime solutions could reduce deaths in maternity wards from 18% to less than 2%. But instead of being celebrated for this discovery, he was ridiculed, ostracized, and eventually driven to a mental breakdown by colleagues who refused to accept that their hands could be instruments of death. You would have witnessed the fury that Semmelweis's suggestions provoked in established physicians. Senior doctors would storm out of lectures where hand-washing was discussed, claiming that such ideas were attacks on their professional competence and personal honour. Medical journals published scathing editorials, dismissing hand-washing as a fad that distracted from real medical practice. The resistance went beyond mere professional pride. The medical establishment had developed elaborate theories to explain why hand-washing was unnecessary and potentially harmful. You would have been told that doctors' hands became seasoned through exposure to disease, developing natural immunity that protected both doctor and patient. Washing away this protective seasoning was believed to make doctors more susceptible to infection. Hospital administrators actively discouraged hand washing because it slowed down medical procedures and used expensive soap and water. You might have seen signs in hospitals warning doctors not to waste time with unnecessary washing when patients were waiting. Efficiency was valued over cleanliness, and doctors who spent too much time washing were criticized for neglecting their duties. The surgical gowns of the era reflected this attitude toward cleanliness. You would have seen surgeons wearing the same blood-stained coats for months or even years, proud of the accumulated stains as evidence of their experience and dedication. A clean surgical coat was actually viewed with suspicion. It suggested that the doctor was either new and inexperienced or too fastidious to be a serious practitioner. Operating theatres were designed without consideration for cleanliness. You would have been operated on in rooms where medical students ate their lunches, where stray dogs wandered in from the street, and where sawdust on the floor was changed only when it became too soaked with blood and pus to absorb more. The idea that the environment itself could harbour dangerous organisms was completely foreign. The tools used in surgery reflected this same disregard for hygiene. You might have been operated on with instruments that had been used on previous patients without any cleaning between uses. Surgical saws, knives, and forceps were wiped clean of visible blood and tissue, but the concept of sterilization didn't exist. The same tools that had been inside infected wounds would be used inside your supposedly healthy body. Even more disturbing was the practice of surgeons testing their scalpel's sharpness by cutting their own fingers or thumbs, then immediately using those same blades to cut into patients. You would have watched your surgeon slice his own contaminated flesh, examine the wound for sharpness, and then turn that same blade on your body without any cleaning or concern. The medical education system reinforced these dangerous practices. Medical students would spend their mornings in dissection rooms, handling decomposing corpses with their bare hands, then attend clinic sessions where they examined living patients without any hand washing in between. You might have been examined by a student whose hands had just been inside a cadaver that had been rotting for weeks. The turning point came slowly, beginning in the 1862nd, when Joseph Lister began promoting antiseptic surgery based on Louis Pasteur's germ theory. But even then, resistance was fierce and prolonged. You would have witnessed heated debates in medical societies, with older physicians insisting that their unwashed hands had never harmed anyone, while younger doctors presented statistics showing dramatically reduced infection rates in hospitals that practiced hand washing. Some hospitals developed compromise policies that satisfied no one. You might have been treated in institutions where doctors were required to wash their hands, but only with plain water and no soap, because soap was considered too harsh for gentlemen's hands. Others required hand washing, but allowed doctors to dry their hands on communal towels that were changed infrequently, defeating much of the purpose. The final acceptance of hand washing came only after overwhelming evidence made denial impossible. Hospitals that adopted strict hand-washing protocols saw their death rates plummet so dramatically that even the most stubborn physicians couldn't ignore the results. You would have witnessed the grudging admission by medical authorities that perhaps, just perhaps, clean hands might actually save lives. But the transition took decades. As late as the 1892nd, some prominent surgeons were still arguing against hand washing, claiming that it made their hands too soft and sensitive for proper surgical work. They preferred their hands to be rough and calloused, believing this made them better surgical instruments, regardless of what bacteria they might be harbouring. The cost of this resistance was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of patients died from infections that could have been prevented by something as simple as soap and water. New mothers died of childbed fever transmitted by doctors' hands. Surgical patients died from infections introduced during operations. All because the medical establishment refused to believe that a gentleman's hands could carry death. When you wash your hands today, before preparing food or after using the bathroom, you're practicing a form of hygiene that was once considered an insult to professional dignity and social standing. The simple act of hand washing represents a victory over professional arrogance and social prejudice that took decades to achieve and cost countless lives to learn. Number 5. The armour of grime, when dirty clothes were your shield against disease. For months on end, you would have worn the same woolen garments, watching them gradually stiffen with accumulated sweat, dirt, food stains, and bodily fluids until they could almost stand up by themselves. But far from being embarrassed by this state of affairs, you would have felt protected, armoured by the thick crust of grime that you believed formed a barrier between your vulnerable body and the diseases that lurked in the outside world. This wasn't a case of having no choice in the matter. Even wealthy individuals who could afford multiple sets of clothing deliberately chose to wear the same garments for extended periods because changing clothes too frequently was believed to be dangerous to your health. You would have been taught that your body's natural oils and secretions, trapped in the fabric, created a protective layer that kept illness at bay. Your typical medieval outfit would have consisted of a linen undergarment, a woolen tunic or dress, woolen stockings or leg coverings, and perhaps a cloak for cold weather. These items, once donned, might remain on your body for 3 to 6 months at a time. The linen undershirt was supposed to absorb your body's impurities, but it was rarely, if ever, washed, instead gradually turning from white to yellow to brown to black as it accumulated months of bodily secretions. The wealthy had a different approach, but one that was equally unhygienic by modern standards. Instead of wearing the same clothes for months, they would change their linen undergarments frequently, sometimes several times per day, while keeping their outer garments on for extended periods. You might have owned dozens of linen shirts or chemises, but only 1 or 2 woolen gowns or doublets that you would wear continuously for months at a time. This practice created a strange paradox where your undergarments were scrupulously maintained, while your visible clothing became progressively more filthy. Visitors to your home would judge your cleanliness by the crisp whiteness of your collar and cuffs peeking out from beneath outer garments that might be stiff with months of accumulated grime. The medical establishment provided scientific backing for these practices. Physicians would explain to you that frequent clothing changes disrupted the body's natural balance of humours. They believed that the oils and secretions trapped in your clothing helped regulate your body temperature and protected you from bad air that could cause disease. Changing clothes too often was thought to leave you vulnerable to sudden temperature changes that could prove fatal. Religious authorities also endorsed minimal clothing changes. You would have been taught that excessive attention to clothing was a form of vanity that distracted from spiritual matters. Monks and nuns were praised for wearing the same simple robes for months or years without washing, and lay people were encouraged to follow their example of focusing on the soul rather than the body. The practical aspects of medieval clothing care made frequent changes difficult even for those who might have wanted them. Your woolen garments were incredibly labour-intensive to clean. The process involved careful brushing to remove surface dirt, airing in sunlight to kill some parasites, and occasionally having the garments beaten with sticks to knock out embedded dirt. Actually, washing woolen clothes with water and soap was rarely done because it could shrink, distort, or damage the expensive fabric. Sleeping in your day clothes was not just common but recommended. You would have been told that changing into different clothes for sleeping weakened your body's defences and made you more susceptible to night vapours and evil spirits. Many people slept in exactly the same clothes they wore during the day, sometimes for weeks or months at a time. The accumulation of parasites in unwashed clothing was simply accepted as part of life. Your garments would have been home to fleas, lice, and other insects that lived and bred in the fabric. You would have developed elaborate techniques for dealing with these parasites without actually washing your clothes, picking them off by hand, using special combs to remove eggs, or exposing your clothes to strong smoke to drive out the insects temporarily. The social aspects of dirty clothing were complex and contradictory. While extremely filthy clothes were avoided in polite society, moderately dirty clothes were seen as evidence of hard work and moral character. You would have been suspicious of someone whose clothes were too clean, as it suggested they were either vain about their appearance or didn't engage in honest labour. During times of plague and epidemic disease, the belief in protective dirty clothing became even stronger. You would have been absolutely convinced that washing your clothes during a plague outbreak was suicidal because it removed the protective barriers that kept disease organisms from reaching your skin. People who maintained their usual clothing washing routines during epidemics were sometimes viewed with suspicion or blamed for spreading disease. The textile industry of the time actually supported these practices by producing clothing designed to hide dirt and wear. Fabrics were woven in colours and patterns that made stains less visible, and garments were cut in styles that could accommodate the stiffening that occurred when cloth became saturated with bodily secretions. Even undergarments were designed with extended wear in mind. Your linen shirt or chemise would have been cut very full and loose to provide room for the fabric to accommodate swelling and stiffening as it absorbed months of sweat and oils. The expectation was that these garments would gradually change shape and texture as they were worn, eventually becoming almost like a second skin. The turning point came in the 18th century when new understanding of disease transmission began to challenge these beliefs. But even then, change was slow and uneven. You might have lived in a transitional period where some people began changing clothes more frequently, while others clung to traditional practices, creating social tensions and confusion about proper hygiene. The development of cheaper textiles and better washing techniques in the 19th century finally made frequent clothing changes practical for ordinary people. But the transition wasn't immediate. Many people continued wearing the same clothes for weeks at a time simply because that's what they had always done, and the idea of daily clothing changes seemed wasteful and unnecessary. The health consequences of wearing the same clothes for months were severe but not understood at the time. Skin infections, fungal diseases, and parasitic infestations were rampant. Many of the skin conditions that medieval people attributed to bad humours or divine punishment were actually caused by the bacterial and fungal growth encouraged by their unwashed clothing. When you change your clothes tonight, you're rejecting a practice that was once considered medically sound, economically practical, and morally virtuous. The fresh, clean clothes you put on represent a revolution in thinking about personal hygiene that took centuries to develop and cost countless lives to learn. Number 6. The miracle metal, when mercury was medicine's silver bullet. Every morning, you would have swallowed a spoonful of liquid mercury, watching the silvery metal slide down your throat as you trusted in medicine's most versatile cure-all. Whether you suffered from constipation, syphilis, depression, or tooth decay, mercury was prescribed as the miracle treatment that could restore your health and vitality. You would have considered yourself fortunate to have access to this precious medical substance that glittered like liquid starlight in its small glass vials. This wasn't some primitive folk remedy practiced by untrained healers. Mercury was prescribed by the most educated physicians taught in the finest medical schools and used in the most prestigious hospitals throughout the civilized world. You would have paid premium prices for pharmaceutical-grade mercury, trusting that its expense reflected its extraordinary healing powers. The medical theory behind mercury treatment seemed logical within the framework of historical medical understanding. Physicians explained to you that mercury's unique properties, its liquid state at room temperature, and its ability to dissolve other metals, made it the perfect substance to dissolve diseases within the human body. They believed that mercury could literally melt away the corruption that caused illness, leaving you purified and restored to health. For syphilis, mercury was considered so effective that the treatment itself became synonymous with the disease. You would have undergone mercury treatment regimens, lasting months or years, during which you would consume or be rubbed with mercury preparations until you began to salivate excessively, a sign that physicians interpreted as proof that the mercury was working to purge the disease from your system. The mercury salivation cure was particularly horrific. You would have been confined to heated rooms where you were given increasingly large doses of mercury until your saliva production increased to several pints per day. Your mouth would have become so sore that eating became agony, your teeth would have loosened and fallen out, and your breath would have taken on the characteristic metallic odour that marked you as a mercury patient. But rather than seeing these symptoms as signs of poisoning, both you and your physicians would have celebrated them as evidence that the treatment was working. The more you suffered, the more convinced everyone became that the mercury was successfully battling the disease within your body. Patients who didn't develop severe mercury poisoning symptoms were often given higher doses until they did. Women used mercury cosmetics with equal enthusiasm, believing that mercury-based face paints would give them the pale, luminous complexion that was fashionable at the time. You would have applied mercury-laden powders and creams to your face daily, gradually absorbing the toxic metal through your skin, while achieving the ghostly white appearance that society deemed beautiful. The cosmetic mercury industry developed elaborate preparation methods designed to make the metal more appealing and supposedly safer to use. You might have purchased mercury face powder mixed with white lead, creating a cosmetic cocktail that was doubly toxic but promised to deliver the perfect porcelain complexion that marked you as a person of refinement and social standing. Mercury was also prescribed for digestive problems, based on the theory that its weight and mobility would help clear blockages in the intestines. You would have swallowed mercury pills, or liquid mercury itself, trusting that the heavy metal would mechanically push through any obstructions in your digestive system. The fact that mercury often caused severe intestinal distress was interpreted as proof that it was working to clear out accumulated toxins. Children were regularly dosed with mercury for teething, pain, worm infestations, and general health maintenance. You would have given mercury preparations to your babies and toddlers, believing you were providing them with the best medical care available. Infant mortality rates were astronomical, but the connection to mercury poisoning was never made because the symptoms developed gradually and were attributed to other causes. The mercury industry developed increasingly sophisticated preparations to make the treatments more palatable and supposedly more effective. You might have taken mercury mixed with honey, mercury dissolved in alcohol, or mercury combined with various herbs and spices. These preparations were marketed with elaborate claims about their purity and potency, commanding premium prices from patients desperate for cures. Wealthy patients could afford to take mercury treatments at specialized spa resorts, where they would spend weeks or months undergoing supervised mercury therapy in luxurious surroundings. You would have considered this the height of medical sophistication, combining the healing powers of mercury with the restorative effects of mineral waters and country air. The mercury treatment rooms in these facilities were designed like Turkish baths, with heated chambers where patients would sweat while absorbing mercury through their skin and breathing mercury vapors. You would have sat in these rooms for hours at a time, convinced that you were receiving the most advanced medical treatment available anywhere in the world. Even more disturbing was the use of mercury in children's teething powders and soothing syrups. Parents would rub mercury-containing preparations on their babies' gums or give them mercury-laced medicines to calm their crying. The neurological damage caused by this mercury exposure was attributed to other causes, and parents continued using these products because they seemed to quiet their children temporarily. The decline of mercury medicine began in the 19th century when some physicians started to notice that their healthiest patients were often those who hadn't received mercury treatments. But resistance to abandoning mercury was fierce and prolonged. Medical textbooks continued recommending mercury treatments well into the 20th century, and some practitioners never fully abandoned the practice. The transition away from mercury was complicated by the fact that some mercury preparations did appear to work, particularly for certain skin conditions and parasitic infections. This partial effectiveness made it difficult for physicians to recognize that the cure was often worse than the disease, especially since the worst effects of mercury poisoning often didn't appear until months or years after treatment. The last medical uses of mercury persisted surprisingly late into the modern era. Mercury-containing antiseptics were still being used in the 1972nd. Mercury dental fillings remained common until the 1992nd, and some traditional medicines around the world still contain mercury today, despite overwhelming evidence of its toxicity. The human cost of mercury medicine was staggering. Millions of people suffered and died from mercury poisoning, while believing they were receiving the best medical care available. The neurological damage, kidney failure, and systemic poisoning caused by mercury treatments probably killed more people than many of the diseases it was supposed to cure. When you take modern medicine tonight, carefully measured and rigorously tested for safety and effectiveness, you're benefiting from hard-won knowledge about the difference between treatment and poisoning. The tiny pills and measured doses you trust represent a rejection of the more is better approach that made mercury seem like a miracle cure for everything. Number 7. The communal sponge, when public restrooms meant sharing everything. In the grand marble public latrines of ancient Rome, you would have finished your business and then reached for the communal sponge that hung from a stick in a bucket of salt water. This same sponge had just been used by the dozen people before you and would be used by the dozen people after you, but this seemed perfectly normal and hygienic to everyone involved. The tussorium, as it was called, was considered one of the great innovations of Roman civilization. You would have admired the engineering that provided running water to rinse the sponge between uses, and the practical design that made the stick long enough to reach where it needed to go while keeping your hand relatively clean. The fact that you were sharing intimate cleaning duties with complete strangers didn't seem unsanitary. It seemed efficient and communal. These public facilities were marvels of ancient engineering, with marble seats arranged in rows like modern stadium seating, allowing for dozens of people to relieve themselves simultaneously while engaging in casual conversation. You would have chatted with your neighbours about politics, business, or the weather, while all of you shared the same cleaning implements in full view of each other. The social aspect of public toileting was actually encouraged in Roman culture. You would have been taught that using the public latrines was a civic duty that demonstrated your participation in community life. Wealthy Romans would conduct business meetings in the latrines, believing that the relaxed atmosphere encouraged honest conversation and successful negotiations. The communal sponge system was considered more hygienic than using cloth or other materials because the sponge could be rinsed between uses, and the salt water was believed to have antiseptic properties. You would have trusted this system implicitly never imagining that the shared sponge was actually a perfect vehicle for transmitting every intestinal, parasite and bacterial infection present in the community. Different quality sponges were available for different social classes. In the finest public facilities, you might encounter sponges made from the softest sea sponges, carefully maintained and regularly replaced. In more common facilities, the sponges might be coarser and changed less frequently. But the principle remained the same. Everyone shared the same cleaning implements. The maintenance of these communal sponges was actually a specialized job. You would have seen attendants whose responsibility was to keep the sponges clean, the salt water fresh, and the buckets properly positioned. These workers were considered essential to public health, and the best of them took pride in maintaining the highest standards of communal hygiene. Some facilities offered multiple sponges to reduce waiting times, but even then, you might find yourself using a sponge that had just been used by several other people in quick succession. The idea of individual, personal cleaning materials simply didn't exist. It would have seemed as wasteful and antisocial as insisting on your own personal seat or your own personal section of the facility. The practice spread throughout the Roman Empire and persisted long after Rome's fall. Medieval monasteries adopted similar communal cleaning systems, believing that shared facilities promoted humility and discouraged vanity about bodily functions. You might have encountered monastic communities where sharing cleaning implements was considered a spiritual discipline. Even in private homes, families would often share cleaning materials for similar reasons. You would have used the same cloth or sponge as your family members, seeing this as natural and economical rather than unsanitary. The concept of personal hygiene items for such intimate purposes was completely foreign to most cultures for most of human history. The decline of communal bathroom cleaning began gradually as people started to understand disease transmission better, but even then, change was slow and uneven. You might have lived through a transitional period where some facilities offered individual cleaning materials, while others maintained traditional communal systems, creating confusion and social awkwardness about proper toilet etiquette. The development of paper specifically for toilet use didn't become common until the 19th century, and even then, many people considered it wasteful and unnecessary. You might have viewed paper toilet tissue as an unnecessary luxury, preferring traditional methods that seemed more natural and economical. The health consequences of communal toilet cleaning were severe, but not understood at the time. Intestinal parasites, bacterial infections, and other diseases spread rapidly through communities that shared cleaning implements. Many of the digestive ailments that ancient people attributed to bad food or evil humours were actually caused by the bacterial transmission facilitated by shared toilet facilities. The transition to individual cleaning materials represented a fundamental shift in thinking about personal hygiene and privacy. You would have witnessed resistance from people who saw individual toilet paper as wasteful, antisocial, and potentially harmful to community bonds that had traditionally been strengthened by sharing even the most intimate aspects of daily life. When you use your own personal toilet paper tonight, you're participating in a form of hygiene that would have seemed selfish, wasteful, and medically unnecessary to most of your ancestors. The privacy and individual cleanliness you take for granted represents a revolution in thinking about personal hygiene that took thousands of years to develop. Number 8. The healing dung, when fresh manure was applied to open wounds. When you suffered a cut, burn, or other wound, the first treatment you would receive was a generous application of fresh animal dung pressed directly into the open flesh. This wasn't emergency field medicine or the desperate measure of someone with no other options. This was the recommended treatment found in the most respected medical textbooks and practiced by the most educated physicians of the time. You would have been carefully instructed about which type of dung was best for your particular injury. Cow dung was considered excellent for burns because of its cooling properties. Horse manure was preferred for deep cuts because it was believed to promote rapid healing. Pig excrement was thought to be especially effective for infected wounds because of its supposed ability to draw out corruption and purify the flesh. The medical theory behind dung treatment was based on the ancient principle of like cures like, and the belief that animal waste contained concentrated life force that could transfer healing energy to damaged human tissue. Physicians would explain to you that fresh dung was superior to aged manure because it retained more of the animal's vital essence and healing power. The application process was elaborate and ritualistic. Your wound would be carefully cleaned of blood and debris, then packed with fresh dung that had been selected for its quality and appropriateness to your specific injury. The dung would be pressed firmly into the wound and held in place with bandages, creating a warm, moist environment that physicians believed promoted healing. Different animals' dung was prescribed for different conditions with the precision of modern pharmaceutical protocols. You might receive goat dung for eye infections, sheep dung for skin diseases, or even human excrement for certain internal ailments taken orally as a medicine. Medical texts provided detailed instructions about how to collect, prepare, and apply these various treatments. Crocodile dung was considered the premium treatment for gynecological problems, imported at great expense from Egypt and prescribed by the most fashionable physicians for wealthy women suffering from reproductive issues. You would have paid enormous sums for access to this exotic treatment, believing you were receiving the most advanced medical care available. The freshness of the dung was critical to its supposed effectiveness. You would have learned to recognize the optimal consistency and temperature that indicated peak healing potency. Dung that was too dry was considered ineffective, while dung that was too liquid was thought to lack the proper concentration of healing essences. Religious authorities often endorsed dung treatments, seeing them as examples of God's providence in providing healing substances from humble sources. You would have been taught that the lowly nature of the treatment was actually proof of its spiritual power, that divine healing could come through the most unexpected means. The practice wasn't limited to external wounds. You might have been prescribed various animal dungs as oral medicines for digestive problems, liver ailments, and general health maintenance. These preparations were often mixed with honey, wine, or herbs to make them more palatable, but the primary active ingredient was still fresh animal excrement. Veterinary medicine also relied heavily on dung treatments. You would have treated sick animals with applications of fresh manure from healthy animals of the same species, believing that this transferred health and vitality from the well animals to the sick ones. This practice actually helped spread diseases through animal populations, though the connection wasn't understood at the time. The quality control for medical dung was taken very seriously. You would have learned to evaluate manure for colour, consistency, odour, and temperature to ensure you were using only the highest quality healing material. Some physicians developed reputations for their expertise in selecting the finest therapeutic dung, and patients would seek them out specifically for their superior materials. Even more disturbing was the practice of using human waste as medicine. You might have been prescribed preparations made from the excrement of healthy children, which was believed to be especially pure and healing. These treatments were often prepared by grinding dried human waste into powder and mixing it with other ingredients to create pills or poultices. The decline of dung medicine began in the 18th century, when some physicians started to notice that wounds treated with manure often became infected and healed poorly compared to wounds left alone. But resistance to abandoning the practice was strong because dung treatments were so deeply embedded in medical tradition and theory. The transition away from dung medicine was complicated by the occasional apparent success of the treatments. Some dung preparations did seem to help certain conditions, probably due to antibiotics naturally present in some animal waste, or to the placebo effect of receiving any treatment at all. These occasional successes made it difficult for physicians to recognize that the treatment was generally harmful. The last medical uses of animal dung persisted surprisingly late into the modern era. Some rural communities continued using cow dung for burns and cuts into the 20th century, and traditional healers in various parts of the world still recommend dung treatments for certain conditions today. The human cost of dung medicine was enormous. Countless people died from infections introduced directly into their wounds through contaminated animal waste. Many injuries that could have healed naturally became life-threatening infections because of the bacteria-laden treatments applied with the best of intentions. When you clean and bandage a wound tonight with sterile materials and antiseptic solutions, you're rejecting a medical practice that was once considered scientifically sound and morally virtuous. The clean, sterile treatment you apply represents a hard-won understanding of infection and healing that took centuries to develop and cost countless lives to learn. Number 9. The bloodletting tools, when contaminated instruments spread death in the name of healing. You would have watched nervously as the barber surgeon approached with his leather case of bloodletting instruments, knowing that these same tools had just been used on the fevered patient before you. The lancets, scarificators, and cupping glasses would still be stained with the blood of previous patients. But neither you nor the practitioner would see anything wrong with this. It was simply how medicine was practiced. The theory behind bloodletting seemed perfectly logical within the medical understanding of the time. You would have been taught that your body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that illness resulted from an imbalance of these vital fluids. Too much blood was believed to cause fever, inflammation, and a host of other ailments, so removing the excess blood would restore balance and health. Your bloodletting session would begin with the practitioner examining your pulse, urine, and general complexion to determine how much blood needed to be removed. Based on this assessment, you might have a few ounces drawn or lose several pints, depending on the severity of your supposed imbalance. The amount of blood removed was often determined more by medical fashion than by any scientific principle. The instruments used for bloodletting were reused constantly, without any cleaning between patients. The same lancet that had just opened a vein in a patient with plague or syphilis would be used to cut into your healthy flesh, transferring whatever diseases the previous patients might have carried directly into your bloodstream. Scarificators were particularly dangerous implements, spring-loaded devices with multiple small blades that created several cuts simultaneously. You would have watched as these devices, crusted with dried blood from previous uses, were pressed against your skin and triggered to create multiple small wounds through which your blood could flow. Cupping glasses, used to create suction that would draw blood to the surface, were rarely cleaned between uses. The same glass that had been pressed against infected skin would be applied to your body, potentially transferring skin diseases, infections, and parasites from one patient to another. The most prestigious practitioners took pride in their elaborate bloodletting instrument sets, displaying them like a surgeon displays modern instruments. You would have been impressed by a barber surgeon who owned multiple lancets, scarificators, and cupping glasses, seeing this as evidence of his success and skill, rather than recognizing the increased potential for cross-contamination. The practice wasn't limited to professional medical practitioners. You might have learned to perform bloodletting on yourself and your family members, using your own set of instruments that were passed down through generations. These family bloodletting kits were treasured possessions, used to treat everything from headaches to broken bones. Religious institutions often provided bloodletting services as part of their charitable work. You might have received bloodletting treatment from monks or nuns who used the same instruments on dozens of patients each day, believing they were performing acts of Christian mercy while unknowingly spreading disease throughout their communities. The seasonal bloodletting calendar dictated when and how much blood should be removed throughout the year. You would have been bled in spring to prepare for the warm months ahead, in summer to cool your overheated system, and in fall to prepare for winter. These regular bloodletting appointments meant that contaminated instruments had multiple opportunities to spread infections throughout the community. Even more dangerous were the mass bloodletting events that occurred during epidemics. When plague or other diseases struck communities, hundreds of people might be bled in a single day using the same few sets of instruments. You would have stood in line with other sufferers, watching as the same blood-soaked tools were used on each person in turn, actually accelerating the spread of the very diseases the treatment was supposed to cure. The bloodletting instruments themselves became reservoirs of disease. Dried blood in the crevices of scarificators and on the blades of lancets provided perfect breeding grounds for bacteria and viruses. Some instruments were used for years without proper cleaning, accumulating layers of biological contamination that made them increasingly dangerous with each use. Children were regularly subjected to bloodletting with the same contaminated instruments used on adults. You might have held your fevered child while a barber surgeon opened a vein with tools that had just been used on plague victims, typhus sufferers, or patients with other infectious diseases. The decline of bloodletting began in the 19th century when some physicians started to notice that patients who avoided bloodletting often recovered better than those who received the treatment. But resistance to abandoning the practice was fierce because it was so deeply embedded in medical theory and tradition. The transition away from bloodletting was complicated by the occasional apparent benefit of the treatment. Some patients did seem to improve after bloodletting, probably due to the placebo effect or because their conditions would have improved anyway. These successes were used to justify continuing the practice, even as evidence mounted against its effectiveness. The last medical bloodletting persisted surprisingly late into the modern era. Some physicians continued the practice into the 20th century, and leeches are still used in some modern medical procedures, though under strictly controlled and sterile conditions that would be unrecognizable to historical practitioners. The human cost of contaminated bloodletting instruments was staggering. Countless people died from infections transmitted through dirty medical tools rather than from their original ailments. Many epidemic diseases spread faster and farther because of medical practices that were intended to heal but actually spread death. When you receive medical treatment today with sterile, single-use instruments, you're benefiting from an understanding of infection control that took centuries to develop. The sterile needles and disposable medical tools you trust represent a rejection of the dangerous but well-intentioned medical practices that killed more people than they saved. Number 10. The street below. When human waste became urban rain. Each morning, you would step carefully into the cobblestone streets, constantly alert for the cry of Gardilou. From above, the warning shout that meant someone was about to empty their chamber pot out of an upstairs window. If you were quick enough, you might dodge the shower of human waste that cascaded down from the buildings above. If you weren't, you'd spend the rest of your day wearing the evidence of your slow reflexes. This wasn't an occasional accident or the result of poor planning. It was the standard method of waste disposal in most European cities for centuries. You would have considered it perfectly normal to use your street as a communal sewer, just as normal as using it as a market, playground, and thoroughfare all at the same time. Your city's streets would have been layered with centuries of accumulated human and animal waste, creating a thick, spongy surface that squelched underfoot and released clouds of noxious gases with each step. During dry weather, the waste would turn to dust that filled the air you breathed. During wet weather, it would become a slippery, treacherous slurry that made walking dangerous and breathing nearly impossible. The wealthy had slightly better arrangements, but not by much. You might have lived in a house with a private privy built over a stream or pit, but even these facilities often overflowed during heavy rains, sending waste flowing through your garden and into your neighbours' properties. The concept of treating or containing human waste simply didn't exist. Night soil men were among the most essential yet despised workers in medieval cities. You would have depended on these workers to collect the human waste from private homes and public facilities, but they were social outcasts who lived in designated areas away from respectable neighbourhoods. Their work was so unpleasant and dangerous that they commanded relatively high wages, but they were forbidden from living among ordinary citizens. The waste collection system was haphazard at best. You might wait weeks for the night soil men to empty your cesspit, during which time the waste would overflow into your cellar, your well water, or your neighbour's property. Complaints about overflowing waste pits were among the most common issues brought before city magistrates. Some cities attempted to regulate waste disposal by designating specific times when chamber pots could be emptied into the streets. You would have learned to time your movements around these scheduled waste dumping periods. But enforcement was minimal, and many people ignored the regulations entirely. The mixing of waste with food preparation was inevitable and accepted. You would have purchased bread, meat, and vegetables from vendors who set up their stalls directly on streets covered with human excrement. The food would be prepared, sold, and eaten in the same spaces where people relieved themselves and disposed of their waste. Water sources were inevitably contaminated by the waste disposal systems. You would have drawn your drinking water from wells that were often located just a few feet from overflowing cesspits. Rivers that served as sources of drinking water also served as sewers, with waste flowing directly from homes and businesses into the same waterways that supplied the city's water. The health consequences were catastrophic, though the connection wasn't understood at the time. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and countless other diseases spread rapidly through populations that lived in constant contact with human waste. You would have accepted these diseases as natural parts of urban life, rather than recognizing them as preventable consequences of poor sanitation. Children played in the same streets where waste was regularly dumped. You would have watched your children run through puddles of sewage, play games in waste-contaminated dirt, and put their hands in their mouths after touching surfaces covered with human excrement. Infant and child mortality rates were astronomical, but the connection to poor sanitation wasn't recognized. The wealthy tried to distance themselves from waste disposal problems by building their homes on hills or in areas with better drainage, but even they couldn't escape the contamination entirely. You might have lived in a mansion with beautiful gardens that were regularly fertilized with human waste from your own household and your neighbors' properties. The psychological adaptation to living with constant waste contamination was remarkable. You would have developed mental strategies for dealing with the sights, smells, and hazards of waste-covered streets. People became experts at avoiding the worst puddles, walking in patterns that minimized contact with waste, and breathing in ways that reduced exposure to the worst odors. Religious authorities often interpreted the waste-filled conditions as reminders of human sinfulness and the temporary nature of earthly life. You would have been taught that the disgusting conditions of daily life were meant to direct your thoughts toward the cleanliness and purity of heaven. The transition to better waste management began slowly in the 18th and 19th centuries, when some cities started to understand the connection between sanitation and disease. But change was gradual and uneven, with some areas maintaining medieval waste disposal practices well into the 20th century. The development of modern sewage systems represented a revolutionary change in urban living. You would have witnessed the transformation of cities from places where waste covered the streets to places where waste disappeared into underground systems that carried it safely away from human contact. When you flush your toilet tonight, you're participating in a waste disposal system that would have seemed like magic to your ancestors. The clean water that flows away carries your waste to treatment facilities that clean it before returning it to the environment. A level of sanitation, sophistication that took centuries of trial, error, and countless deaths to develop. Number 11. The eternal undergarment, when one set of underwear lasted for seasons. For months at a time, you would have worn the same linen undergarments against your skin, feeling the fabric gradually stiffen and discolor as it absorbed sweat, oils, and other bodily secretions. But rather than being disgusted by this state of affairs, you would have felt thrifty and practical. After all, linen was expensive, and washing it frequently was believed to weaken the fibers and shorten its useful life. Your typical set of undergarments would have consisted of a long linen shirt or chemise that reached nearly to your knees, and perhaps linen brays, primitive underwear, if you were wealthy enough to afford them. These garments, once put on in late spring or early summer, might not be removed again until the following season, gradually transforming from white to yellow to brown as they accumulated months of wear. The medical establishment actually endorsed this practice, explaining that frequent changing of undergarments disrupted the body's natural processes and exposed you to dangerous fluctuations in temperature. You would have been taught that your body's secretions, trapped in the linen, created a protective barrier against disease and helped regulate your internal temperature. The wealthy had a different approach, but one that was equally unhygienic by modern standards. Instead of wearing the same undergarments for months, they might change their linen daily or even several times per day, but only the visible parts. You might have owned elaborate collections of detachable collars, cuffs, and shirt fronts that could be changed frequently while keeping the main body of the undergarment on for weeks or months. This created a bizarre hierarchy of cleanliness, where the parts of your undergarments that others could see were kept pristine white, while the parts hidden beneath your outer clothes were allowed to become progressively more filthy. Visitors would judge your hygiene by the crispness of your collar, while you wore the same undershirt that you'd been living in for months. The laundering of undergarments was such a major undertaking that it was typically done only a few times per year. You would have designated specific seasons for washing your linen, usually spring and fall, during which your entire household's accumulated undergarments would be subjected to an intensive cleaning process that took several days to complete. The washing process itself was so harsh that frequent laundering really would have destroyed the expensive linen fabrics. Your undergarments would have been boiled in large cauldrons with lye soap, beaten with wooden paddles to loosen embedded dirt, and then laid out in fields to dry and bleach in the sun. This process was so labour-intensive and damaging to the fabric that avoiding it seemed practical rather than disgusting. Children were particularly affected by the practice of wearing the same undergarments for extended periods. You would have put your young children in linen garments at the beginning of a season and left them in the same clothes until the weather changed. The smaller the child, the more quickly their undergarments would become soiled, but changing them frequently was considered wasteful and potentially harmful to their health. The development of body lice and other parasites was simply accepted as an inevitable consequence of wearing undergarments for extended periods. You would have developed elaborate techniques for dealing with these parasites, without actually washing your clothes, picking lice and eggs by hand, using special combs to remove parasites, or exposing your undergarments to smoke or extreme heat to kill the insects. Religious authorities supported the practice of wearing the same undergarments for long periods, seeing it as evidence of proper humility and lack of vanity about bodily comfort. Monks and nuns were particularly praised for wearing the same simple linen garments for months or years without washing, and lay people were encouraged to follow their example. The social implications of underwear changing were complex and sometimes contradictory. While extremely dirty undergarments were avoided in polite society, moderately soiled linen was actually preferred to completely clean garments because it showed that you weren't vain about your appearance and that you had better things to think about than constant clothes changing. Even sleeping garments followed the same pattern. You would have slept in the same nightgown or nightshirt for weeks or months at a time, believing that changing sleeping clothes frequently was unhealthy and potentially dangerous. Many people slept in their day clothes or in undergarments that served both functions. The transition to more frequent underwear changing began in the 18th century when cotton became more widely available and affordable. Cotton was easier to wash and dry than linen, making more frequent changing practical for the first time. But even then, daily underwear changes were considered excessive by most people. The development of underwear specifically designed to be changed frequently didn't occur until the 19th century. You would have witnessed the gradual introduction of lighter, less expensive undergarments that were intended to be washed regularly rather than worn for months at a time. The health consequences of wearing the same undergarments for months were severe but not understood at the time. Skin infections, fungal diseases, and bacterial overgrowth were rampant. Many of the skin conditions that people attributed to bad humours or moral failings were actually caused by the prolonged contact with contaminated fabric. When you change into fresh underwear tonight, you're participating in a form of personal hygiene that would have seemed wasteful, vain, and potentially dangerous to most of your ancestors. The clean, comfortable undergarments you put on represent a revolution in thinking about personal cleanliness and textile care that took centuries to develop. Number 12. The wonder drug, when laudanum made pain disappear along with your life. When chronic pain, menstrual cramps, or sleeplessness plagued your days and nights, you would have reached gratefully for the small brown bottle of laudanum that promised relief from all suffering. This opium-based tincture, mixed with alcohol and flavoured with spices, seemed like a miracle cure that could transform your agony into peaceful contentment with just a few drops on your tongue. Laudanum wasn't hidden in back-alley drug dens or sold by disreputable characters. It was the most respectable medicine available, prescribed by the finest physicians, and sold openly in pharmacies alongside other household remedies. You would have purchased it as casually as you might buy aspirin today, trusting in its reputation as medicine's most reliable solution to human suffering. The preparation of laudanum was considered a high art among pharmacists and physicians. You might have received a bottle containing opium dissolved in wine, brandy, or grain alcohol, flavoured with saffron, cinnamon, or cloves to mask the bitter taste. The most expensive preparations contained the highest concentrations of opium, and you would have paid premium prices for these stronger formulations. For women's health problems, laudanum was considered especially appropriate and effective. You would have been prescribed regular doses for menstrual pain, childbirth recovery, and the various ailments that physicians grouped under the vague category of female complaints. Many women took laudanum daily for months or years, believing they were treating legitimate medical conditions. The dosing instructions for laudanum were often vague and dangerous. You might have been told to take enough drops to relieve the pain, or to continue taking it until the symptoms subside. Without understanding of addiction or overdose risks, people often increase their doses gradually as their tolerance developed, eventually taking amounts that would be considered lethal by modern standards. Children were regularly given laudanum for a wide variety of conditions. You would have administered drops of opium tincture to your feverish baby, your teething toddler, or your restless child, believing you were providing the best medical care available. Many patent medicines marketed specifically for children contained substantial amounts of opium disguised with sweet flavors. The social acceptability of laudanum use meant that addiction developed openly and without shame. You might have known neighbors, friends, or family members who took laudanum regularly, but this was viewed as necessary medical treatment rather than drug dependence. The concept of addiction wasn't well understood, and regular opium use was often praised as evidence of proper attention to one's health. Some laudanum preparations were marketed as general health tonics rather than medicines for specific ailments. You would have taken daily doses believing you were maintaining your overall health and preventing future illness. These health maintenance formulations often contained lower concentrations of opium but were taken in larger quantities, leading to the same addictive effects. The wealthy could afford to consult physicians who would create custom laudanum preparations tailored to their specific needs and preferences. You might have received a personally formulated tincture that combined opium with other drugs and herbs, creating cocktails of psychoactive substances that were believed to address your particular combination of physical and emotional ailments. Writers and intellectuals often praise laudanum for its ability to enhance creativity and provide relief from the stresses of mental work. You would have read testimonials from famous authors and thinkers who credited laudanum with improving their artistic output and helping them cope with the demands of intellectual life. The military regularly supplied laudanum to soldiers for pain relief and to help them cope with the psychological stresses of warfare. You might have served in armies where laudanum was distributed as routinely as food rations, creating entire units of men who were functionally addicted to opium while still expected to perform their duties. Religious authorities generally approved of laudanum use, seeing it as God's gift for relieving human suffering. You would have been taught that refusing to use available pain relief was a form of pride or false martyrdom, and that accepting laudanum's benefits was actually a form of gratitude for divine providence. The decline of widespread laudanum use began in the late 19th century, when medical understanding of addiction began to develop. But the transition was slow and difficult because laudanum really did provide effective pain relief, making it hard to distinguish between legitimate medical use and drug dependence. Even as the dangers of laudanum became better understood, many people continued using it because they had been taking it for so long that stopping caused severe withdrawal symptoms. You might have found yourself unable to function without your daily laudanum dose, experiencing tremors, nausea, and overwhelming anxiety whenever you tried to reduce your intake. The regulatory response to laudanum addiction was gradual and inconsistent. Some jurisdictions began requiring prescriptions for opium-based medicines, while others continued to allow over-the-counter sales well into the 20th century. You might have lived through a period where laudanum was simultaneously being banned as a dangerous drug and praised as an essential medicine. The human cost of laudanum dependence was enormous, but largely hidden from public view. Thousands of people, particularly women and children, suffered from opium addiction that began with legitimate medical treatment. Many died from overdoses or from the health complications caused by long-term opium use, but these deaths were rarely attributed to the medicine itself. When you take modern pain medication tonight, carefully measured and regulated for safety, you're benefiting from hard-won knowledge about the difference between pain relief and drug dependence. The precise dosing and addiction warnings that accompany modern painkillers represent a rejection of the take until you feel better approach that made laudanum seem like a harmless cure-all. Number 13. The natural weakness. When women's pain was always in their heads. When you complained of persistent abdominal pain, irregular bleeding, or chronic fatigue, your physician would have nodded knowingly and diagnosed you with female weakness, a condition that supposedly proved that women's bodies were naturally frail and poorly designed for the demands of daily life. Your symptoms weren't investigated or treated. They were simply explained away as evidence of your inherent biological inferiority. This wasn't ignorance or prejudice disguised as medicine. It was the official medical doctrine taught in the finest medical schools and practiced by the most educated physicians of the time. You would have been told that your uterus was a wandering organ that moved through your body causing various ailments, or that your menstrual cycle made you temporarily insane and therefore unreliable in your own descriptions of your symptoms. The concept of female weakness encompassed virtually any health complaint a woman might have. Whether you suffered from headaches, digestive problems, joint pain, or emotional distress, the diagnosis would be the same. Your female nature made you prone to mysterious ailments that were best treated with rest, mild sedatives, and acceptance of your natural limitations. Your physician would have explained that women's bodies were designed solely for reproduction, and that any energy or attention diverted to other activities would inevitably result in health problems. Education, physical exercise, professional work, or even reading too much were believed to cause your reproductive organs to malfunction, leading to the various symptoms you experienced. The treatment for female weakness often involved enforced idleness that made your condition worse rather than better. You might have been prescribed bed rest for weeks or months, forbidden from reading, writing, or engaging in any mentally stimulating activities. This isolation and inactivity often led to actual depression and physical deterioration that physicians then cited as proof of your original diagnosis. More severe cases of female weakness might result in treatments that were actively harmful. You could have been subjected to cold water treatments, where you were immersed in ice-cold baths or had cold water poured over your body for hours at a time. These treatments were supposed to shock your reproductive system back into proper function. Some physicians prescribed mechanical devices designed to treat female ailments through vibration or electrical stimulation. You might have undergone treatments with early vibrating machines that were believed to restore proper function to your disordered reproductive organs. These treatments were often painful, invasive, and completely ineffective. The psychological component of female weakness diagnosis was particularly damaging. You would have been told that your symptoms were largely imaginary, caused by your inherent tendency toward hysteria and emotional instability. This gaslighting made you doubt your own experiences and taught you to minimize or hide your symptoms rather than seek proper treatment. Even when you had obvious physical ailments, like infections, tumors, or injuries, these were often attributed to your female weakness rather than treated as legitimate medical conditions. You might have suffered from serious gynecological infections that were dismissed as normal consequences of your gender rather than treatable diseases. The social implications of the female weakness diagnosis extended far beyond medical treatment. You would have found yourself excluded from education, employment, and public life based on medical opinions about your inherent frailty. Society used medical authority to justify treating women as permanent invalids who needed constant protection and supervision. The diagnosis was often used to control women's behavior and choices. If you expressed interest in education, careers, or independence, These desires themselves might be diagnosed as symptoms of female weakness that required medical intervention. Your natural ambitions were pathologized as evidence of mental and physical disorder. Religious authorities often supported the medical doctrine of female weakness, seeing it as confirmation of women's subordinate role in God's plan. You would have been taught that accepting your physical limitations was a form of Christian humility, while seeking to overcome them was prideful rebellion against divine will. The economic aspects of female weakness created a lucrative industry of treatments and products marketed specifically to women. You might have spent enormous sums on patent medicines, specialized equipment, and extended treatments that promised to cure your inherent female ailments while actually providing no medical benefit. Even women who were clearly suffering from serious medical conditions were often misdiagnosed with female weakness. You could have had heart disease, diabetes, or other serious ailments that were dismissed as typical female complaints rather than receiving proper diagnosis and treatment. The decline of female weakness as a medical diagnosis began slowly in the late 19th century, when some physicians started to recognize that women's health complaints often had specific, treatable causes. But progress was slow and uneven, with many doctors continuing to attribute women's symptoms to their gender, rather than investigating actual medical causes. The transition away from female weakness diagnoses was complicated by the fact that many women had internalized these beliefs about their own bodies. You might have continued to attribute your symptoms to natural female frailty even when more knowledgeable physicians were available who could provide real diagnosis and treatment. The legacy of female weakness diagnoses persisted well into the 20th century and continues to influence medical treatment of women today. The tendency to dismiss women's pain as psychological rather than physical, to attribute women's symptoms to their reproductive organs, regardless of the actual cause, and to assume that women are naturally more frail than men, all stem from this historical medical doctrine. When you receive proper medical attention for your health concerns tonight, with doctors who take your symptoms seriously and investigate their actual causes, you're benefiting from a revolution in medical thinking that rejected centuries of prejudice disguised as science. The respectful, thorough medical care you receive represents a hard-won victory over a medical establishment that once dismissed half the population as inherently defective. Number 14. The livestock housemates. When animals shared your bedroom. Every night, you would have settled down to sleep, surrounded by the warm bodies, heavy breathing, and distinctive odours of the pigs, goats, chickens, and cattle that shared your living space. This wasn't a sign of poverty or poor planning. It was considered practical, economical, and even beneficial for both human and animal health to live together in the same rooms. Your typical medieval home would have been a single-room structure where the family slept on one side while the livestock occupied the other side, with no barrier between the two areas, except perhaps a low wooden partition that animals could easily step over. You would have gone to sleep each night to the sounds of snoring pigs, clucking chickens, and the occasional lowing of cattle just a few feet from your bed. The practice was based on practical considerations that seemed logical at the time. You would have benefited from the body heat generated by the animals during cold winter months, reducing your need for fuel to heat your home. The animals, in turn, were protected from predators, thieves, and harsh weather by being brought inside your dwelling. The economic advantages seemed obvious to you and your neighbours. Keeping animals inside meant you could monitor them constantly, preventing theft and ensuring they remained healthy and productive. You could collect eggs from chickens that roosted in your bedroom, milk cows that stood in your kitchen, and tend to sick animals without leaving the comfort of your home. Religious authorities often endorsed the practice of living with animals, seeing it as following the example of Christ's birth in a stable surrounded by livestock. You would have been taught that sharing your home with God's creatures was a form of Christian charity, and that the humble circumstances demonstrated proper religious humility. The medical establishment actually recommended cohabitation with animals in many cases. Physicians would explain that animals generated healthy vapors that could cure various human ailments. You might have been specifically advised to sleep near cows, to cure consumption, or to share your bed with a goat to draw out the corrupt humours that caused arthritis. Different animals were believed to provide different health benefits through proximity. You would have learned that pigs were especially good for warming cold constitutions, that sheep could help with insomnia, and that chickens were beneficial for children's growth and development. Some families deliberately chose their animal housemates based on the health conditions they hoped to address. The wealthy had their own versions of animal cohabitation, though they managed it somewhat differently. You might have lived in a manor house where precious hunting dogs slept in the master bedroom, exotic birds lived in the great hall, and valuable horses occupied stalls connected directly to the main house. The principle remained the same: valuable animals lived as close to their owners as possible. Children were raised to see living with animals as completely normal and beneficial. You would have taught your children to sleep alongside piglets, to share their food with chickens, and to treat livestock as part of the extended family. Many children formed strong emotional bonds with the animals that shared their homes. The hygiene implications of animal cohabitation were severe, but completely ignored. You would have breathed air thick with animal dander, bacteria, and parasites every night. Your bedding, clothing, and food would have been constantly contaminated with animal hair, saliva, and waste products. Disease transmission between humans and animals was rampant but not understood. You might have contracted tuberculosis from infected cattle, influenza from pigs, or various parasitic infections from close contact with multiple animal species. The concept of zoonotic diseases, illnesses that pass between animals and humans, didn't exist in your understanding of health and disease. The waste management challenges of indoor animals were handled with primitive and ineffective methods. You would have laid down straw or rushes on your floors that absorbed animal urine and feces, changing this bedding occasionally when it became too saturated to be tolerable. The waste-soaked straw was often composted and used to fertilize crops, creating cycles of contamination. Some regions developed specific architectural features to accommodate animal cohabitation. You might have lived in a house with a raised sleeping platform for humans, while animals lived on the ground floor, or in structures with removable wall panels that allowed animals to be brought inside during harsh weather. The decline of animal cohabitation began gradually as people started to understand disease transmission and as housing became more affordable, but the transition was slow and uneven, with some rural communities continuing to live with their animals well into the 20th century. The development of separate housing for animals represented a major shift in thinking about health, hygiene, and the proper relationship between humans and livestock. You would have witnessed resistance from people who believed that separating animals from their owners was cruel to the animals and potentially harmful to human health. When you sleep tonight in your clean, animal-free bedroom, you're enjoying a form of living arrangement that would have seemed wasteful, unhealthy, and potentially dangerous to most of your ancestors. The separation between human and animal living spaces represents a revolution in thinking about hygiene and health that took centuries to develop and implement. Number 15. The poisoned wells, when your drinking water was everyone's toilet. Every morning, you would have drawn your family's drinking water from the same well or river that served as the neighborhood's toilet, garbage dump, and animal watering hole. This wasn't an unfortunate coincidence or poor urban planning. It was the inevitable result of communities that had no understanding of water contamination or any systems for separating drinking water from waste disposal. Your village well would have been located in the centre of the community for everyone's convenience, often just a few feet from the church, the market, and the area where people relieved themselves. You would have lowered your bucket into water that was contaminated with human waste, animal droppings, rotting food scraps, and the runoff from every unsanitary practice in the community. The water you brought home to your family would have been cloudy, foul-smelling, and teeming with bacteria, parasites, and other disease-causing organisms. But you would have considered this normal and acceptable. After all, it was the same water everyone else was drinking, and you had no alternative sources available. Rivers and streams that served as community water sources were simultaneously used for waste disposal, washing clothes, watering animals, and dumping industrial waste. You would have seen tanners disposing of toxic chemicals upstream from where you collected drinking water, butchers washing blood and offal in the same river that supplied your household, and your neighbours using the riverbank as an outdoor toilet. The wealthy tried to distance themselves from the worst water contamination by building their own private wells or purchasing water from sources they believed were cleaner. But even these supposedly superior water sources were often contaminated because no one understood how contamination spread through groundwater or how far upstream pollution could affect water quality. City water systems, where they existed, were primitive and often made contamination worse rather than better. You might have received your water through wooden pipes that were riddled with holes, lead pipes that poisoned the water they carried, or open aqueducts that collected every form of pollution along their route. The storage of drinking water in homes created additional opportunities for contamination. You would have kept your water in wooden barrels, ceramic pots, or leather containers that were rarely cleaned and often shared with other household uses. The same container that held your drinking water might also be used for washing clothes, storing food scraps, or even as a chamber pot in emergencies. Children were particularly vulnerable to waterborne diseases because they had no choice but to drink whatever water their families provided. You would have given contaminated water to your babies and toddlers, unknowingly exposing them to cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and countless other diseases that spread through polluted water supplies. The medical establishment actually endorsed many practices that made water contamination worse. Physicians would recommend that you drink water mixed with wine or beer to make it healthier, not realizing that the alcohol sometimes helped kill bacteria and made contaminated water slightly less dangerous by accident. Some communities developed elaborate rituals around water collection that provided psychological comfort but no actual protection from contamination. You might have participated in ceremonies to bless the community well, believing that religious ritual could purify water that was contaminated with sewage and industrial waste. The seasonal variations in water quality were extreme and unpredictable. During dry periods, your well water would become increasingly concentrated with whatever pollutants had accumulated in it. During wet seasons, runoff from surrounding areas would wash even more contamination into your water sources. Animal contamination of drinking water was constant and unavoidable. You would have shared your water sources with pigs, cattle, chickens, and wild animals, all of which defecated directly into or near the water you drank. The concept of keeping animals away from human water supplies simply didn't exist. Industrial pollution made urban water supplies even more dangerous than rural ones. You might have lived in a city where breweries, tanneries, metalworking shops, and other industries dumped their waste products directly into the same rivers and streams that supplied drinking water to thousands of people. The development of cholera epidemics was directly linked to contaminated water supplies, though this connection wasn't understood until the mid-19th century. You might have lived through cholera outbreaks that killed thousands of people in your community, never realizing that the disease was spreading through the water you were drinking every day. Even when better water sources were available, traditional beliefs often prevented people from using them. You might have avoided drinking from clear, clean springs because they were believed to be the homes of spirits or fairies, preferring to drink from polluted community wells that were considered safer because they were blessed or sanctified. The transition to clean drinking water began in the 19th century, when some cities started to understand the connection between water quality and disease. But progress was slow and expensive, with many communities continuing to use contaminated water sources well into the 20th century. The development of water treatment and purification systems represented a revolution in public health that saved millions of lives. You would have witnessed the transformation of cities from places where drinking water was a constant health hazard to places where clean, safe water was available at the turn of a tap. When you turn on your kitchen faucet tonight and fill a glass with clean, safe drinking water, you're accessing a resource that would have seemed miraculous to your ancestors. The pure, tasteless water you drink represents centuries of scientific discovery, engineering, innovation, and public health advocacy that transformed one of humanity's most basic needs from a source of disease and death into a foundation of health and life. As we reach the end of our journey through humanity's most disgusting hygiene habits, it's worth reflecting on the remarkable transformation that brought us from those dark, dirty, and dangerous times to our current understanding of cleanliness and health. The practices we've explored tonight weren't the result of ignorance or laziness. They were the logical conclusions drawn from the medical knowledge, scientific understanding, and cultural beliefs of their time. Each of these unhygienic practices persisted because they seemed reasonable to the people who practiced them. Avoiding baths made sense when you believed that water opened your pores to disease. Using mercury as medicine was logical when you thought it could dissolve illness itself. Sharing dental tools seemed practical when individual ownership was considered selfish and wasteful. The heroes of this story are the brave physicians, scientists, and public health advocates who challenged these dangerous practices despite facing ridicule, professional ostracism, and sometimes physical danger. People like Ignaz Semmelweis, who was driven to a mental breakdown for suggesting that doctors wash their hands, represent the courage required to overturn centuries of accepted medical practice. The transformation from these unhygienic practices to modern cleanliness standards didn't happen overnight. It required the development of germ theory, the invention of antiseptics and antibiotics, the creation of public health systems, and fundamental changes in how people understood the relationship between cleanliness and health. But perhaps most importantly, it required a shift in values, from accepting suffering as inevitable to believing that it could be prevented, from viewing individual hygiene tools as wasteful to understanding them as necessary, from seeing cleanliness as vanity to recognizing it as essential for health and social responsibility. The cost of learning these lessons was enormous. Millions of people died from diseases that could have been prevented by practices we now consider basic common sense. Countless lives were lost to the very medical treatments that were supposed to save them. The human price of our ancestors' hygiene mistakes reminds us how precious and hard-won our current knowledge really is. Yet there's something both humbling and hopeful in this history. It reminds us that what seems obviously true today might prove to be dangerously wrong tomorrow. It encourages us to remain open to new evidence and new ideas, even when they challenge practices we've always taken for granted. As you go about your evening routine tonight, washing your hands with soap, brushing your teeth with your own personal toothbrush, changing into clean clothes, sleeping in a clean bed away from animals, remember that you're participating in one of humanity's greatest victories over disease and death. The simple acts of personal hygiene that seem so natural to you represent thousands of years of trial, error, discovery, and gradual improvement. The story of human hygiene is ultimately a story of hope. It shows us that even the most entrenched, dangerous practices can be changed when we're willing to challenge old assumptions and embrace new knowledge. It reminds us that progress is possible, even if it's slow and difficult, and sometimes costs everything. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your clean, safe, animal-free bedroom, take a moment to appreciate the long journey that brought humanity from those disgusting, dangerous practices to the cleanliness and safety you enjoy today. And remember that this journey isn't over. We're still learning, still improving, still working to make life cleaner, safer, and healthier for everyone. Thank you for listening to this exploration of humanity's most unhygienic habits. If you enjoyed this journey through the darker chapters of our hygiene history, please consider liking and subscribing. Your support helps us continue to explore the fascinating, disturbing, and ultimately hopeful stories of how humanity learned to live better, cleaner, and safer lives. Sweet dreams, and may your modern hygiene practices protect you from the nightmares our ancestors lived through every day.